one that sees us eye to eye, is the one that actually sides with the minorities of Iran, people who've been oppressed, who traveled to the region, who've been to Iraqi Kurdistan, who've seen the minorities, the rights deprived. Ladies and gentlemen here, I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce you to an author, activist, a gentleman run for Congress, Ken Timmerman.
Thank you. Thank you, Hussein, and thanks to all of you for being here. I've done this type of conference and this type of event for many, many years. In 1995, I set up with a bunch of Iranian friends, American friends, people who went on and served in the Bush administration, Bush 43, a group called the Foundation for Democracy in Iran, Iran.org. It still exists. We began with funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, and it's something I actually want to spend a few minutes telling you about here today. I think it's very important. But first, I just want to say, this has been a really great conference. It's been a really great conference. I've seen more hope here, less posturing, more hope, less political rhetoric, and more concrete suggestions than I've seen in a long time. And it's really thanks to you, Hussein. I think you've done a great job. You really have.
Get on my knees before the woman.
Well, there you go. It's important for me as an American to get the Iranian regime right. And I have made a point of the past 5, 6, 7 years to no longer refer to the Islamic Republic of Iran. People say, oh, you talk about the Iranian government. It's not the Iranian government. I get that. But it's not the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's the Islamic State of Iran. We're dealing with basically a Shiite version of ISIS. So that is something that you might want to keep in mind when you talk to members of Congress. This is not just a sweet, somewhat religious regime, kind of conservative, and they actually look like Republicans in the South. No, not at all. That is not true. They look like ISIS people who cut your heads off. The difference between a moderate mullah and a radical mullah? Oh, there's a big difference. The moderate mullah, first he will steal your wallet, then he will cut your head off. The radical mullah will just cut your head off first. And that is the only difference. That is the only difference. And I think, obviously, you as Iranian Americans, you understand this. But Americans do not understand this. They do not understand that. You, sir, talked earlier today about culture. You mentioned that with Congressman Issa. To emphasize the importance of culture. It is tremendously important. This regime in Iran, they do not think the way that Americans do. They do not think in terms of cost-benefit analysis. They do not respond to our Western notions of the cost of their behavior. They were willing, during a period of sanctions, to forego $150 billion of income to pursue a nuclear weapons program. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. No Western country would have done that. France would not have done that. Germany, Belgium would not have done that. $150 billion. All right, they knew that we had leaders that were dupe enough to give it back to them. But still, they do not think the way we do. And I think that's something else that you all, we together can help to educate Americans about. American leaders in Congress and the rest. They understand force. They understand force. And they understand if when we really have resolve as a government and as a people, they will back down. They learned this in 1988 in Operation Praying Mantis. This was when the U.S. Navy sank 1/3 of the regime's naval forces in a single battle in less than 48 hours. And what did the Iranian regime do? Nothing. Nothing. When the U.S. and the Israelis finally caught up with Imad Mughniyeh, the regime's top at that time overseas terrorist, the man who had masterminded the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut in April of 1983. By the way, I write about that in my latest book, and the rest is history. I can tell you a few things about this in a second. He masterminded the attack on the U.S. Marines in Beirut in October of 1983. 241 Marines dead. The biggest loss of life for the U.S. Marines in a single day since I think it was Guadalcanal. All right. And on and on and on. He had a terrorist pedigree a mile long. We finally caught up with him in Damascus in 2008, in February of 2008, and substituted the spare tire on his Pajero and sent him off to a very fiery death and afterlife. I am sure he will be burning. He is still burning today. What did the Iranian regime do? Nothing. Nothing. Fast forward in January of 2020, January 2nd of 2020, there were something like 25,000, 30,000 Iranian-backed militiamen in Baghdad who were surrounding the U.S. Embassy. And their goal was to take the U.S. Embassy. And it was very clear. I was watching this minute by minute. And it was, President Trump responded in a way that his predecessor did not. In Benghazi, he immediately flew 800 U.S. Marines up from Kuwait to protect the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, number one. But even more important than that, he gave the go-ahead when intelligence came up with the flight plan of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force. He gave the go-ahead to take him out. And that, I believe, was one of the greatest accomplishments of the Trump administration, outside of perhaps the Abraham Accords or moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, but it was one of the great accomplishments in our Middle East policy under President Trump, was killing Qasem Soleimani. And again, what did the Iranian regime do? Nothing. They launched a couple of missiles to the that air base in Iraq. And by the way, they told us ahead of time, right? They told us ahead of, we don't really want to kill you guys because they did nothing. So when we are strong, when we act with resolve, this regime will do nothing. The regime in Tehran will do nothing. You need, as Iranian activists, to reach that kind of power. And here are a couple things you might want to think about. Today, what I've heard is a heartening sense of unity of people from different backgrounds, different ages, different generations, coming together with a single agenda, which is essentially freedom, life, freedom, women. And these are simple things, and yet simple things are what unite us. The desire to be free of a regime. You might want to look towards the National Endowment for Democracy. This it's a congressionally funded organization. I was helped in getting an initial fund for the Foundation for Democracy in Iran by friends in Congress. You have friends in Congress. You might want to think about an umbrella organization, perhaps like SOS Iran or something else, an umbrella organization that could use funding in a transparent way, because this is very important. The problem, I can tell you in the past, in giving money to Iranian organizations, Americans say is, where does the money go? Where is the accountability? Where is the transparency? When you have a U.S. nonprofit, a registered 501c3 with a board of directors that has to report back to the National Endowment for Democracy for every penny sent, you have transparency and you have accountability. And if you have that transparency and accountability, I would suggest going to NED, National Endowment of Democracy, instead of groups like NIAC that have gone to them, which is a scandal, absolute scandal that NIAC was able to get funding from them at one point. So think about that. I think that's important. The other thing I'd like you to think about, and I know many of you here in this room already are. It is so important in a country as large as Iran, a country as diverse as Iran, to remember that you're all, what? Iranians. You're not Kurds, you're not Baluch, you're not Azeri, you're those things as well. And those things are very important. But you're all Iranians, and you do have an Iranian identity. I remember at one of our conferences, Iman was with me, and in 2007, and I think that we came this close. It was an organization called Solidarity Iran. And we met in Paris, and then there were other meetings later on. And it was sabotaged. I found out later the meeting was sabotaged, this attempt to bring 300 people together from all different walks of life, left and right, and Kurd and Baluch and Persian and nationalists and constitutionalists and the whole 9 yards. And it was sabotaged by a handful of individuals who were paid for by the Iranian regime. They are very good at this. They are very, very good at this. They are good at infiltrating. They will walk right into this room. They'll wear a suit just like anybody else here or be elegantly dressed as a woman, and they will come here with a different agenda than you have. And their agenda will be to make sure that it does not work. But I heard from this one Kurdish woman who was the regime agent, and we were talking about Makdom and Keshvar, and what's the difference, and Kurdish people. And she said in the end, this was the showstopper, Iran and Keshvar Nist. After all that work, we'd been talking for hours and hours and hours, and I thought I'd finally gotten them. She said, Iran Keshvar Nist. Iran is not a country. And oh, great. Iran is a country. Of course Iran is a country. Iran is a country. And I would stand here and as an American say, with confidence, that the overwhelming majority of Iranians today inside Iran want freedom, and they want to get rid of this regime. And I think as Ali Mahdavi said earlier, there may be a list, 100, maybe 1,000 people in the regime, at senior places in the regime. When you see those people leaving the country, when you see them investing in Vancouver real estate, or in Toronto real estate, when you see them moving their assets into Germany, or perhaps it will be South Korea, where some of the frozen oil money is, that's when you should prick up your ears. Because that's, I believe, how it will happen. They have their ears glued to the ground. They know exactly what's going on inside the country. They get all the feedback from the intelligence services and the police and everyone else. And when they start moving out, that's when it's going to happen. That is when it's going to happen. And I think, that movement is not that far ahead of us. I mentioned earlier to Congressman Issa about, I mentioned the money in Iraq, in the Central Bank of Iraq. Tremendous means of putting pressure on the Quds Force, which I think is the main right now, is really the backbone of the regime, the Quds Force. They are doing what the Islamic, quote-unquote, Republic Constitution calls for, which is to spread their revolution around the world. That is what they are the ones responsible for spreading the revolution and spreading terror around the world. By cutting back the amount of illegal cash that they were getting, it was as much as $1 billion a month. $1 billion a month. This is what people in Iraq were telling me 5-6 years ago. They were getting $1 billion a month in black money, skimming off the top of the U.S. dollar Iraqi dinar exchange. You cut that off, and you make senior people in the Quds Force really unhappy. Really unhappy. And you might make them begin to consider other serious lifestyle changes, like becoming Canadian citizens. By the way, Canadians are not really like Americans either. They think different ways than we do. Have any of you been to Toronto and been there during the Hezbollah march? I was there with a buddy a couple of years ago, and it's one of the most astonishing things I have ever seen in a Western country. Thousands of Hezbollahis with the yellow flags, the Lebanese yellow flag, people dressed in like Imad Mounier in the camouflage uniform, directing traffic and flagellating themselves right on Bar, and unbelievable, thousands and thousands of them, and then a few pockets of either monarchists or leftists, tends to be one of the two. Some of my friends from the Fedayan were there, communist, a Marxist group. How can you be a Marxist in today's world? But there are still Marxists around, and half of them are Iranians. But it is what it is. Yeah, some of them are here.
Oh my!
But this is something that we can never allow to happen in the United States. The closest that we get to it, and it's close enough for my comfort, is NIAC walking the halls of Congress, or NIAC people in the White House, or NIAC people in the State Department. That's already way too close.
MEK as well.
They were there.
The MEK is a whole other ball of wax, and
Yes, no, we witnessed yesterday.
yes, the MEK is a whole other ball of wax. And those of you who know me, I have put. You can go to Iran.org, and you will find an entire half of the website devoted to the documents that demonstrate the true nature of the MEK, starting with Rajavi's embrace of Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War. And I have yet to meet an Iranian nationalist, especially someone who's lived through the Iran-Iraq War, who can ever excuse Masoud Rajavi for kissing the ring of Saddam Hussein. Wow. That was something that is unforgivable, and I think is ultimately disqualifying. So I want to tell you just a couple of words about this book, because it is an important book. It tells some stories about Iran in it. I was a hostage in Lebanon in 1982. I was reborn to my Christian faith there. I went on and covered wars all throughout the Middle East, was interviewing Iranian freedom fighters from the very start in the 80s and thereafter. I became briefly an arms dealer, according to the New York Times. Of course, if you're called an arms dealer by the New York Times, it's official. So I was officially an arms dealer. And for a brief period, I became an Israeli spy. So you can learn about that in this book. I've got copies out here outside, how I became a hostage, an arms dealer, and an Israeli spy. And the second volume, which will be out in a year and a half, is called The Iran House. And it brings you up to date from the end of this book to the killing of Qasem Soleimani. So I want to commend all of you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's a pleasure to be associated with this organization. And this is a great fight that you are all fighting. And I think finally, we can see some light at the end of the tunnel. God bless you. Thank you.